All right, here we go. This is going to be a fun one. So, I've been wondering a lot about these messianic predictions in the Bible. You hear this thing like, the odds that Jesus fulfilled even six of the prophecies is the same odds as Texas being filled up with quarters and there being one red quarter and a blind person searching around and picking up one quarter and that was the red one. So it's like one in trillion, trillion, trillion things. You hear this in the case for Christ, and a bunch of people use this. So I'm looking into it, and it's obviously a lot, and I'm trying something new today. I know people say don't use AI and Perplexity to research the Bible, but I'm doing all avenues. I'm reading the Bible for myself. I'm watching debates. I'm doing a bunch of things, but I'm trying something new today, which is NotebookLM. So basically, I did a ChatGPT prompt, this big prompt for a deep research, and I'll read you the prompt. I just transcribed it, so it's probably going to sound kind of dumb. But I said, okay, I've been hearing a lot about the prophecies in the Old Testament that Jesus fulfilled and how there's the odds of him actually fulfilling those is very small, and it points to the fact that he's true and real. And I want to know how much truth there is to that and how many prophecies he actually predicted. But I want you to look at the original Hebrew and what it really meant in context in addition to the Greek in the New Testament and what that really meant to see if the prophecies are actually accurate and if it's actually fair to say that he fulfilled them. I want you to look at the entire body of scholarly research, consensus, and fringe opinions to find the most likely and reasonable report of what really happened, what the Bible really says, and if he really did fulfill these predictions, and if he did, what are the odds of those prophecies being fulfilled, and are there any that he didn't fulfill that would have been about the Messiah, etc. And really tease out which prophecies were about the Messiah, which weren't, how we know, etc., and give me a comprehensive view of this whole Jesus prophecy, Old Testament fulfillment situation. Okay, so I did that, and I did that on ChatGPT, and it gave me a giant research report. It researched for like 20 minutes, and then I did it on Perplexity as well. And then I loaded both of these in to NotebookLM. And if you don't know what NotebookLM is, it basically allows you to add a bunch of sources here, and you can put text, files, videos, websites, any kind of sources you want here. And then you can basically make different ways of looking at those sources. So you can make a mind map. So if you look at this, you can see, you get this mind map where it's like Jesus in the Old Testament and then these different topics, right? So you can go categories of fulfillment, controversial prophecies, and then each of these open into like a whole big ass thing. And then these each open into a big thing. And you can read about it and chat with Google about it and everything. Anyways, so that's just one of the things you could do. What I did was you can make a report, flashcards, quiz, audio overview. If you do audio overview, it basically generates a podcast.
Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping right in today.
And it just goes over the reports in podcast form. So we're going to listen to that and let's see what we get.
Really big claim when you hear a lot. It's this idea that Jesus fulfilled, hundreds of Old Testament prophecies against, astronomical odds. You asked us to really look into this past the usual stories, get into Hebrew, the Greek, see what scholars actually say. So that's our mission.
Yeah, and it's crucial we do that because the reality, it's way more complicated than the simple story often presented, these fulfillment narratives. We really need to look hard at the original texts and their context.
Okay, so where do we even start? I guess the first thing you notice is just the sheer number people claim. Like, you see apologetics resources claiming 48 fulfilled prophecies. Then others say 300, 456. I've even seen 570.
That huge variation tells you almost everything up front, doesn't it? 48 versus 570. It shows there's no real agreement, not scholarly, not even really theologically, on what even counts as a messianic prophecy in the first place. The counting, well, it often depends on already believing Jesus is the Messiah. So you pick the texts that fit. It's kind of circular reasoning.
And crucially, right, a lot of these passages Christians point to. Jews back then didn't read them that way.
I get the impression that these moderators are atheists.
Exactly. Before the Christian interpretation, many of these texts were seen as, historical accounts or comments on politics then, or just psalms. They weren't generally seen as these detailed blueprints for a future individual. Early Christians really changed the game in how these texts were read.
So that's the core question, isn't it? Are we finding prophecies in the Hebrew Bible, or are we reading Jesus back into it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Okay. So today, let's dig into maybe 4 key examples. We'll look at their original context, tackle those big probability claims, and see how Christian expectations differed from Jewish ones back then. Let's start with a big one, the virgin birth. Isaiah 7.14.
Ah, yes. Isaiah 7.14, foundational, and honestly a perfect case study in how translation can change everything. The line usually quoted is, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son."
Okay, but break down the original language for us. What did Isaiah actually write in Hebrew?
Right. The Hebrew word there is alma, and alma just means young woman or maiden, could be married, could be unmarried. It doesn't inherently specify virginity. Now, if Isaiah had wanted to say virgin specifically, there's a perfect Hebrew word, betula. He uses betula elsewhere in his book, so the fact he used alma here seems, well, deliberate.
Wow, okay. So the whole virgin idea, it's not really in the original Hebrew. Where did it come from then?
It comes in much later. Around 200 BCE, Jewish scholars were translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek. That translation is called the Septuagint. And when they translated Alma, they chose the Greek word parthenos. Now, parthenos can mean virgin,
Well, good.
but it often just meant young woman or unmarried girl, too. It's similar to Alma. It wasn't exclusively virgin.
Hang on. So you're saying one of the absolute cornerstones of Christian doctrine relies on a Greek translation choice that might have kind of stretched the original Hebrew meaning.
That's pretty much the scholarly consensus, yeah. And then Matthew's gospel
Oops.
quotes this Greek Septuagint version, not the Hebrew. So that virgin reading got locked into the Christian tradition right there.
Okay, but even putting the translation issue aside for a second,
Hmm.
what was Isaiah 7.14 even about originally? Was Isaiah thinking 700 years ahead?
Almost certainly not. The context is immediate. It's politics in 735 BCE. Isaiah is speaking directly to King Ahaz, who's terrified of an attack by Syria and Israel. Isaiah gives him a sign. Look, this young woman, Alma, will have a son, Emmanuel. Before that child is old enough to know right from wrong, your enemies, those two kings you fear, will be gone. It was a short-term sign for Ahaz about that specific crisis. It happened in Isaiah's time.
So the big scholarly takeaway is this was a sign for King Ahaz fulfilled back then, and it only became a virgin birth prophecy much later because of that Greek translation choice, and Matthew ran with it.
Yes, essentially. Scholars see it as a prime example of reinterpretation. Matthew, believing in Jesus, read the scriptures through that belief. He applied the text to Jesus to show how Jesus fit the promises, rather than finding an explicit prediction of Jesus in the text itself.
Okay, let's shift gears. Maybe the most powerful passage people point to, Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. It describes someone innocent suffering for others' sins. It sounds incredibly like Jesus' passion.
The parallels are striking, you can't deny it. An individual silent before accusers dies, buried with the wicked and the rich. His suffering heals others. It really does read like a blueprint for Jesus' death and resurrection on the surface.
But again, context.
Yeah.
What does Isaiah itself say about who this servant is?
Well, right around chapter 53, in the sections leading up to it and following it, chapters 40 to 55, specifically, Isaiah repeatedly says who the servant is, explicitly, multiple times. You, Israel, are my servant. The consistent pattern in those chapters strongly suggests the servant is the nation of Israel, suffering collectively in exile.
Now, I've heard the counterargument that interpreting the servant as Israel was just something rabbis like Rashi came up with much later, in the Middle Ages, specifically to argue against Christians.
Yeah, that's a common claim, but it's actually not accurate. We have evidence from way earlier. The church father Origen, writing around 248 CE, actually recorded that the Jews of his day interpreted Isaiah 53 as referring to the nation of Israel suffering. So that interpretation goes way, way back. It wasn't just a medieval invention.
Okay, but was it unanimous? Did any ancient Jewish sources see the servant as the Messiah, an individual?
It wasn't completely black and white, no. There was some nuance. You find texts like the Targum Jonathan, an Aramaic paraphrase, or some bits in the Talmud that do link the servant figure to the Messiah. But here's the fascinating part. Even when they did that, they often had to kind of twist the text. They'd reinterpret the suffering part so they applied to Israel, or maybe the Messiah's enemies, but not the Messiah himself. It shows just how deeply uncomfortable the idea of a suffering and dying Messiah was. It clashed with their main expectation of a conquering king.
That really highlights the tension between interpretation and expectation. Okay, let's look at a case where the expectation was supposedly met.
Yeah.
Micah 5.2, born in Bethlehem.
Micah 5.2. This one's a bit different from Isaiah 7. The idea that the ruler, the Messiah, would come from Bethlehem, David's town, that was a genuine Jewish expectation before Christianity. People were looking for that.
And yet, Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth, right? Universally.
That's the historical puzzle. Mark's gospel, the earliest one, never mentions Bethlehem. John's gospel, same deal. It's only Matthew and Luke who have the birth narratives placing Jesus there. And their stories are quite different, actually contradictory. One has a census journey, the other a flight to Egypt, but both achieve the same goal, getting Jesus born in Bethlehem.
So what do scholars generally conclude from that?
The consensus is that, historically, Jesus was almost certainly born and raised in Nazareth. The Bethlehem birth stories appear to be theological constructions, added later by Matthew and Luke. Not necessarily reporting history, but making sure Jesus fit that specific, known messianic requirement from Micah 5.2, shaping the story to match the perceived prophecy.
Which leads us neatly into Psalm 22, the crucifixion psalm. I mean, the parallels are just uncanny. The mocking, the thirst, dividing clothes by casting lots. That last one's in all four Gospels.
It is remarkable, yes, the overlap is strong. But again, there's a catch, a big one, actually. It's a textual issue, specifically with verse 16. Christian Bibles often translate it as, "They pierced my hands and feet."
Sounds exactly like crucifixion.
It does. But the standard Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, reads kari, which means something like a lion at my hands and feet. The difference in Hebrew is tiny, just one letter, but the meaning changes drastically. Like a lion is, well, pretty obscure, but it definitely doesn't mean pierced. Plus, you have the historical issue. Crucifixion wasn't really a thing when David supposedly wrote this psalm, maybe 1000 BCE. The Romans perfected it much later.
For what's the implication then? Could the Gospel writers have used the psalm as a script?
That's the critical perspective, yes, that the writers, believing Jesus' suffering must have been prophesied, looked to Psalm 22, and they might have consciously woven details from the psalm, the mocking, the thirst, the garments, into their crucifixion accounts. Not necessarily inventing things out of whole cloth, but describing the events using the language of the psalm to show it was all happening according to the scriptures, using it as a kind of literary template.
Okay, this idea of narrative shaping, reinterpretation, it makes those huge probability numbers seem even more questionable. Like Peter Stoner's calculation 1 in 10 to the 17th power, just for 8 prophecies. How do those odds stack up against this kind of analysis? If the numbers are right, doesn't that settle it?
They really don't hold up under scrutiny, I'm afraid. That whole line of argument, while it sounds impressive, is generally dismissed by professional historians and statisticians. It's seen as apologetics, trying to prove a point, not objective scholarship.
Why? What's wrong with the math?
There are several fatal flaws, mostly in how they select the data and calculate the odds. First, it's what's called a posteriori manipulation, working backwards. They start with Jesus, see what aspects of his life seem to match certain Old Testament verses, then calculate the odds of those matches happening by chance. It's like shooting an arrow at a barn wall and then drawing the target around where it landed. You're cherry-picking the hits.
Right, selecting the data after you know the outcome. What else?
Second, the probabilities themselves are just made up. Arbitrary assignments. That figure you sometimes hear, like 1 in 280,000 chance of being born in Bethlehem. Where does that number come from? There's no actual statistical basis for it. They're just guesses designed to produce a large final number.
Okay, so cherry picking and made up numbers. Is there more?
Yes. Third, a basic mathematical mistake, assuming independence. Many prophecies are linked. If someone is known to be from the line of David, their chances of having a connection to David's hometown, Bethlehem, go way up, right? They aren't independent events like flipping separate coins. You can't just multiply the probabilities together like that. It inflates the odds massively and incorrectly.
And the last point, some things could just be deliberate actions.
Exactly. Fourth flaw, including controllable prophecies. Things Jesus or his followers could have intentionally done. The classic example is riding to Jerusalem on a donkey to fulfill Zechariah 9.9. The Gospels say Jesus told his disciples to go get the donkey. He orchestrated it. If you intentionally fulfill something, the probability isn't 1 in a million, it's 100%. It doesn't count towards astronomical odds.
So those mind-boggling odds just kind of evaporate when you look closely at the methods.
Pretty much. The methodology is flawed from the start. Bad statistics, selection bias. It doesn't work as a historical or mathematical argument.
Okay, so we've seen prophecies reinterpreted, narratives possibly shaped. But what about the other side of the coin? What about the big main expectations for the Messiah back then that Jesus clearly didn't fulfill during his lifetime?
Oh, yes. This is where you see the starkest difference between traditional Jewish messianic hopes and what Christianity presented. In Second Temple Judaism, the main expectation was for a Messiah who was basically a political and military leader, a king, someone who would achieve very specific, tangible things on earth.
Like what was on that messianic job description?
Top of the list, rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, the third temple, gather all the Jewish exiles back to Israel from around the world, usher in an age of universal peace, end all war, Isaiah 2, swords into plowshares, and crucially, reign as an actual victorious king on earth during his
But
lifetime.
Jesus did none of those during his ministry.
No, historically that's clear. Wars didn't stop. The Jewish diaspora continued. He didn't set up an earthly kingdom. And the existing temple wasn't rebuilt by him. It was destroyed by the Romans about 40 years after his death.
That's a massive disconnect from the primary expectations. How did the early Jesus movement handle that failure to deliver on the main promises?
It was a huge challenge. Their response was essentially to develop the idea of two comings. The first coming, they argued, was Jesus as the suffering servant, fulfilling passages like Isaiah 53 that hadn't been central before. The second coming, his future return, is when he will be the conquering king and fulfill all those other prophecies, rebuilding the temple,
I'll go back a
bringing
little bit. I
Possibly
wasn't paying
shaped.
attention.
But what about the other side of the coin? What about the big main expectations for the Messiah back then that Jesus clearly didn't fulfill during his lifetime?
Oh, yes. This is where you see the starkest difference between traditional Jewish messianic hopes and what Christianity presented. In Second Temple Judaism, the main expectation was for a Messiah who was basically a political and military leader, a king, someone who would achieve very specific, tangible things on earth.
Like what was on that messianic job description?
Top of the list, rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, the third temple, gather all the Jewish exiles back to Israel from around the world, usher in an age of universal peace, end all war, Isaiah 2, swords into plowshares, and crucially, reign as an actual victorious king on earth during his lifetime.
But Jesus did none of those during his ministry.
No, historically that's clear. Wars didn't stop. The Jewish diaspora continued. He didn't set up an earthly kingdom. And the existing temple wasn't rebuilt by him. It was destroyed by the Romans about 40 years after his death.
That's a massive disconnect from the primary expectations. How did the early Jesus movement handle that failure to deliver on the main promises?
It was a huge challenge. Their response was essentially to develop the idea of two comings. The first coming, they argued, was Jesus as the suffering servant, fulfilling passages like Isaiah 53 that hadn't been central before. The second coming, his future return, is when he will be the conquering king and fulfill all those other prophecies, rebuilding the temple, bringing peace, gathering the exiles.
So the traditional Jewish view, or a critical historical view, would see this two comings idea as a later adjustment.
Yes, essentially a post hoc explanation. A theological framework developed after Jesus' death to make sense of why the main expected messianic events didn't happen during his life. It reconciles the reality of the historical Jesus with the scriptural promises by splitting the fulfillment into two stages.
Okay, let's try and pull all these threads together then. We started with claims of hundreds of prophecies fulfilled against impossible odds. We've looked at specific texts, seen reinterpretation, maybe narrative shaping, translation issues, and now these major unfulfilled expectations. So at the end of this deep dive, what's the most reasonable way to understand the relationship between Jesus and the Old Testament prophecies?
I think the most balanced scholarly view is this. The Old Testament doesn't contain a clear, unambiguous, detailed checklist or blueprint predicting the specific life of Jesus, which he then uniquely fulfilled against all odds. That narrative doesn't really hold up to close scrutiny of the texts and history. Instead, it looks much more like the early Christians, profoundly impacted by their experiences of Jesus, especially the resurrection, went back to their scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. And they intensely reread those texts, looking for ways to understand who Jesus was and what his life and death meant. They applied texts to him, sometimes quite creatively, often lifting them from their original context to build a theological case.
That process you mentioned earlier, retrofitting, finding the connections after the fact.
Exactly. They were convinced Jesus was the fulfillment, so they found the ways the scriptures pointed to him. That's why the connections can seem so strong. They were actively constructed because of the belief in Jesus.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. Consider this. Jesus' death on a cross was, by all standards of the main Jewish messianic expectations of the time, a disaster, a failure, the opposite of a conquering king. But that very failure seems to have forced his followers to go back and grapple intensely with texts like Isaiah 53 and Psalm 22, the suffering texts. Could it be that the crucifixion itself, the biggest unfulfillment of the kingly expectation, was actually the very thing that created the Christian understanding of prophecy?
That's a really provocative question, isn't it? Did the prophecies clearly predict Jesus beforehand? Or did the powerful belief in Jesus radically change how his followers read and understood those ancient prophecies? Something to think about.
Keep digging, keep questioning. We'll catch you next time on the Deep Dive.
Wow. Okay, that was pretty that was pretty rough. Does I asked it to not be biased. That seemed pretty biased, so I'm doing another report. And I'm saying, give me a report that is based in truth and reality, but makes the case for Jesus being the Messiah based on the Old Testament prophecies, stay accurate, and rely on the Hebrew and Greek original text in context as much as possible. So it's making that, and then I did a Perplexity one too. So I'm gonna do this again where you get both things. So I'm gonna add a source here, and we're gonna go upload, and we're gonna go this one. Okay. And then we're gonna wait for our, I wonder if my food's gonna be here soon. Anyways, we're gonna wait for our ChatGPT to go. ChatGPT, I feel like, goes a lot deeper and it researches for way longer, where Perplexity like usually takes about 3 to 5 minutes for a report, and ChatGPT usually takes about like 20 minutes. So I feel like ChatGPT researches way more sources and stuff like that. But I have some McDonald's that's on the way. Guess if anyone's watching, I'll put on a
I'll just mention
well,
yellow number.
I'm gonna put on a YouTube video for you while I go get my food in a bit. Oh, I guess I can't because I need my phone.
I'll just mention yellow number 5 was shown in a recent.
I made a mistake. How can I get my... Maybe I can log into Grab on here. Or no, because I need my phone. Fuck. Okay. Anyways, that was interesting. Well, I'll come back and do the other one next.